out later where it is.
Yes, yes. Thank you, George. Ah, okay. Um, would someone be willing to open with prayer?
Yes, I can do that.
All right, thank you.
Dear Heavenly Father, we are here because we belong to you and because we are involved in communicating the gospel of Jesus Christ to other people, and because of our desire to do that in the best way, in a way that people understand and apply to their lives. And so we ask you that as we enter into our time together, that you will lead our thoughts, that you will lead our what we say, and that you will be our guide, as you always are, and help us to go into the tracks of thinking that you want us to learn more about. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Well, Eddie is not able to join us, and neither is Alina. Today, we want to talk about the main differences between oral and print ways of thinking and learning. And Marlene was going to lead us in that by introducing ourselves again, by sharing a song or a story or something that we learned as children to teach us.
Because when we were children, we didn't use script ourselves. And when we learned something, it was in the oral way. So we can feel when we think of that time how it worked and how it worked for other people. So everyone can get a turn and tell what he did himself. Coco, can you start?
Yes, Coco, you had a good example here from when you were a child, and I'll put up that picture and you can tell us about that story.
Sorry, I just turned on my microphone. I was talking by myself. Um, yeah, when I was a child, there were some children's stories that were popular by that time, and I even have now the tape when my parents recorded me telling this story. It is about the goat and her 3 kids, and she had to leave and home and let them by themselves, and she gave them instructions not to open the door to anyone, but the older son opened the door to the wolf, who ate him, and the younger son got hidden in, I don't know where. I mean, I know, but I don't know the word. And so he, because he was obedient, he got saved. So I was well. The story is a little cruel, as I see it now, but it helped me understand that I might be in danger if I don't obey my parents, and so I never opened the door to foreigners, or I knew this very well. And I was by myself my whole life. when I was 6, I started going to school by myself, and yeah.
Okay, that's a good example.
This is the furthest I know, the younger I was. There are some when I was older, but this is the first one I remember. Yeah.
That's a, this is Ron, that's it seems to be a well-known Romanian kind of folktale, because when we went to learn Romani at this one conference, everyone expected us to know that story, and it really put us behind in the class for a couple hours.
Ron, this is Tanya. That's when our language knowledge isn't our only problem.
Exactly.
Okay, Marlene, who should be next?
Oh, never mind. Mariana.
Okay, I had just a short saying which says, kinderen die vragen worden overgeslagen, meaning children who ask, they will be skipped in the handing out of things or whatever. They will be skipped, really is what it only says, but it means don't ask for things, just wait until it's your turn to be given something.
Now it's Mickey's turn. I know you have something.
Okay, this is also a little rhyme. Mabel, Mabel, if you're able, keep your elbows off the table. Because when I was young, it was considered impolite to eat with your elbows on the table. So especially my father used to use that rhyme to remind us to keep our elbows off the table.
Does anyone else have something to contribute?
Sure, I can do mine. Mine is more musical. As a musician, I remember things from musical. I will not sing the song to you today because I'm a little also under the weather, but it was a story, well, two different songs that I remember. One was a song that told the names of the 12 disciples. And so I can tell you all the names of the 12 disciples because I know the story or the song. And then the other that we learned when I was in, so that one, of course, was learned in Sunday school. But the second I learned in school, and it was a song with the 50 states in the United States in it. And so now when I'm playing a game and it says, what are the 4 states that start with an M? I just have to sing through the song till I get to the letter M, and I can tell you with no problem. So those were two that helped me learn larger portions of things that I never would have been able to memorize otherwise.
Good example. So, Ron, do you have something?
I do. I had another song from Sunday school days, which was the books of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, the Epistle to the Romans, and I won't go all 27, but it had all 27 there. And then Debbie had another saying.
I think I immediately thought of the proverb that says a stitch in time saves 9. And, it was definitely about sewing things on time, but also about fixing any problem while it's small before it gets bigger.
That's good. Those are good examples. about how it works. I feel that's a good example.
Then, and we could probably all give a lot of other examples as we thought about it. Then we sort of, as a sort of a review of oral and print, oral communication and print communication cultural differences, we wanted to discuss our homework, particularly the number C. What are some cultural differences? I wanted to also, before we begin, point out that that the materials we read also point out that there's a continuum between people who are oral and people who are literate. And Keith likes to talk about people who are literate, but they still prefer oral communication. And then I remember reading also that different people who may know how to read use that reading differently. That's a different topic, but it's something to keep in the back of our minds. So let's look at some of the differences that we noted between our culture, our print-oriented culture, and the target culture, or the culture that we worked in. And I'm going to try to, once again, share my screen. Yeah, no, I don't want to stop sharing. And call up, we're going to start with what Alina wrote, because it's fun the way she wrote it. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
No, now.
Now you can't. Now you see it. Now you can't.
No,
Here we
I
go.
do.
Okay. I'm going to make it a little bigger. It's way too big. She said she lives in Sweden now, and she's from Romania. She said in Sweden, people know ahead everything they're going to do for at least the current year. And a lot of Dutch people do too. However, among Roma people that she worked with, most of the people don't know what they're going to do in the current day in their free time. In Sweden, you cannot visit somebody without a preliminary appointment. But among the Roma, you can simply show up at somebody's house. In Sweden, you do not ask questions about the private life of somebody. It is okay to refuse answering to an inquisitive person. But among the Roma that she worked with, at the first contact, people can ask you all kinds of intimate questions, and if you refuse to answer, they will consider you unfriendly or arrogant. Now I'd like to open this up to discussion and say, which of these differences do you think are related to print versus oral cultural differences? I won't share what she said, but what do you think?
I'd say at least the first one. I mean, for sure the first one, maybe the second one, and maybe not the third one, but for sure the first two. Or for sure the first.
Okay, anybody else? I can kind of see the second one is also sort of tangentially related. Sort of.
Like someone who is more print oriented would have a schedule that they had written down. So having things on that written down schedule would be important to them, would matter. Whereas someone who's just doing oral stuff, they're cool with like, oh yeah, okay, great. Well, stop by or don't stop by. It doesn't matter because they don't have this sort of written idea of what life's going to be like.
Yeah, that's possible. It is also true that the people we meet now who are from an oral culture tend to be either rural people or minority people. And they wouldn't, like, I can imagine that you may have had in pre-industrial societies, you may have had a very important person who could not read or write that you couldn't go visit without a preliminary appointment. But yeah, the neighbor is different. Okay. And what about the third one?
To
You
me,
could ask, go
sorry.
ahead.
To me, all three of them are common to oral culture because in my hometown, you have to schedule. You are educated not to ask questions, but naturally uneducated, you ask questions, like the third statement. But the more educated you are, the more you don't ask.
I think it's also about how do you organize your utopia, your community.
Oh, your community, yeah.
When you organize your community in an oral way, you have to know what a certain person's place is. So it's more common to ask questions.
Yeah, that might be true, and it also might be just a cultural thing.
I don't know.
I'm trying to turn off my telephone. Now I'm successful. Okay, let's go on to some other examples. I'm going to type them out here, and stop sharing my screen.
This is Ron. Just one little thing on the questions. The group we worked with in Peru, up in the mountains, they had certain domains where you ask questions and certain domains where you didn't. And when outsiders came in and asked a bunch of questions, that was really, really rude and stuff.
They're oral.
And they're very oral. So it was like they had context where they could ask you questions that you wouldn't ask another American, but generally questions about their culture and stuff, insider questions. What's that? Any questions?
I think any questions, like, and if you wanted to ask a question, you first had to say, I'd like to ask a question every time. And they could say yes or no then.
So that's just another thing from another part of the world to throw out there on orality and questions and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's useful to point out that some of these things are culture specific. Like, I remember reading about people in Madagascar, and they live in such small communities that everyone knows everything about everybody. And so any new news is carefully given out slowly, a bit at a time. So you wouldn't just ask a whole bunch of questions, because then you'd get all this news at once. So I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but
I do think I think we should be careful to connect everything that is Roma to the fact that they are oral, or to everything that is blank to the fact that they are oral. You know, it's like the psychological thing that more rapes happen from people who are eating ice cream. Well, no, that those things are not connected. And it's actually like I'm using this specific example because it's actually like a psychological, I can't remember what it is, but it was a study that more rapes happened during the same time that people were eating ice cream. Well, the missing factor is that it's the summer. And so we could connect everything that is Roma or everything that is part of an oral culture to the fact that they are an oral culture. But maybe some of those things aren't direct connections. Maybe, like Mary's saying, some of them are just things that we're noticing of the same culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
I wonder if we are concentrating on how this has applications to literacy or to teaching, education. So maybe we can say the things that we notice that are specifically from an oral culture that have to do with communication situations in that culture.
That's a good idea.
Okay, so let's do that. Mariana, do you have some?
Well, I did my homework last night. I sent it to Marlene. I have to see where is it. I was thinking of the culture that I worked with, and one thing that I've lost my screen. Let me try to open up and become part of you here again. One thing that was interesting to us to notice is that the way people perpetuate or reinforce social practices, like rules, for instance. There was a very strong rule in the village where we lived that women and children had to walk behind the houses, whereas men could walk in front of the houses. And this has to, you have to visualize a small strip of land or a beach, actually, because we lived on a beach. And on one end was the sea, and on the other end was a big rock going up quite high. And in between was this beach, and it had some houses on it, and only one house, it was only room for one house, like houses beside each other, but not more than one before the sea was upon you. So that rule of women and children walking behind the houses and men in front of the houses had to do with a very important cultural value that we gradually found out what it was, which was respect. Respecting each other in that culture was enormously important, and it was made visible by this, by not associating with people from the opposite sex that had a certain relationship with you. So even brothers and sisters shouldn't really be too close, and especially not cousins, first cousins couldn't be too close. So the way this was communicated, to us, of course, this was a mystery at first. We noticed things, and then at one point at a communal meal, there was a speech, because this is what people then do to communicate things. They have meals together, often on Sundays, but also for different other occasions. They all sit together on the ground, on the beach, and then as we were eating, one man gets up and starts talking loudly, and to us at first we had to get used to that, but this was a venue where important information is passed on, especially because at a meal all generations are present. There are children, there are elders, there's everything in between. So this one person getting up would then start ruling people out, telling people off for not keeping to that rule. and saying, we really need to keep this rule because this is the way we show respect to each other. And so the interesting part is that the social rule is stated very clearly, and people are scolded publicly for not keeping it, and they are publicly exhorted and encouraged to keep to the rule again. And it all has to do with keeping the peace and the balance and the whatever, the way things supposed to be, to keep that going in the community. So I'm talking about the communication of a person getting up, stating facts, using slight scolding, and then encouraging people to keep on doing, following the rule. So that was one thing, and I think that is definitely something that was particular to this oral culture, and yet, as we have talked about this sometimes, we also know that these kinds of things happen in our cultures. When you go to church, sermons are kind of a little bit like that. They can involve a little bit of scolding, they can involve stating the standard or the rule, and then they can involve encouraging people to keep to that rule. So perhaps this is more done in an oral culture than in a print culture, but I see it in both of our cultures.
Okay. Does somebody have do you have more examples like that? Can't hear you. Does somebody else have another example of print that has to do with communication directly or in particular?
I was thinking about, sorry, am I talking over someone? I was thinking about the concept of time, how that seemed to be quite different in different cultures. But I do not know if that has to do with oral culture or not. You know, the tendency of print-oriented people to be on time, and coming from the culture in the Netherlands where trains are meticulously, on time, on the minute, and that is very important because otherwise everything would mess up. Versus a culture where you make an appointment for a certain time in the morning to get together and start, in our case it was checking through a book of scripture, and then people start coming maybe half an hour later, and it takes about an hour for them to all arrive. So if you can start 2 hours after the proposed time, then you can be happy. And yeah, to learn how to deal with that was difficult for us, and I wonder why. So why, in the end, we had good meetings, but the waiting time for us was hard, but not for the other people. The other people had calculated that in, so I think they were event-oriented. They said, well, today we're going to do this checking of scripture, and it doesn't really matter if it happens right on time, as long as it happens. Maybe that was the cause of the different ways of looking at it. I'm not sure. What do you think?
Yeah, event-oriented people tend to be focused on the community. The event begins not when the clock says it begins, but when the community has gathered. And is that directly related to oral versus print? I don't know. But it is a difference that you encounter, that people encounter, who are Western European, Northern European types like you and me. And we can all probably share stories about this, that the thing begins when the community is gathered. We showed up for a Sinti worship service that starts at 4, and there was no one there. So we went to someone's house and we said, "Is there church today?" "Yeah." "When's it start?" "Oh, about now." So then they went through the Wohnwagenkamp, the community, with the bell ringing it, and when people got there, they started church.
Things with punctuality I encountered a lot in the south of Romania. I have another example about cultural difference. Talking with people all the time, they can be precise or clear when they say things. Like a specific example, bringing shoeboxes. A woman with 2 girls came, which I never saw before, and just before coming back home, I wanted to visit her. So we found out where she lived, and we went there, and she got out, as we never get inside the yard as they have dogs. But she got out, and I asked her, "How many children do you have? I saw you with 2 girls." "Oh, yeah, I have 3. And then she said something about 5. And talking with her, I said, "Okay, what age are they, each one of them?" And she said she had 7. And I still don't know how many children she has, but I know her older son, which is, I think, 20, and her older daughter, who is 14 or 17, I can't remember. They are already married, and the son has a boy. And I think she counted all of them with the in-laws, and I'm not sure how many she has, but I saw here in the material you gave us to read for today, in the last table, which is in parallel oral and print communicators, it says, "Can be imprecise and clarify as needed based on the listener's reaction. Avoid answering questions directly." And reading this made it clear to me how they talk and answer. And in my mean part of the heart, I always thought they were stupid, that they can't answer correctly and precise. But, well, this is their culture. It's not, I shouldn't think of them like that, because this is how they know to answer.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Coco. And I think it's also often reflected in language, because I remember in the culture where we lived, people would define children, and if people would talk about my children, that would include all the children of your sisters or brothers. So technically speaking, my nieces and nephews, I would name them as my children. I would call them my children. So if you ask a person, "How many children do you have?" then they realize, of course, that you may not know this information, but if they don't realize that, then that's confusing, because you name a big number of children, and that in our thinking, Western thinking, that's not really true.
Yes. With the children, it was just an example, but anytime you ask them something, the first answer is very vague. You don't understand. And then as you ask more questions to clarify, then you might find out the answer you want.
This is all very interesting. I've always, when I've come up against inaccuracy, I've always just assumed it was my own language skills. Like, oh, maybe I didn't understand them the first time. Or like when we ask the children in the school how many brothers and sisters they have and they don't know, or they aren't really sure. Maybe it is because they don't remember because there's so many of them, or because some of them have moved away or whatever. But maybe it even goes back to this inaccurate thing, which I had not even recognized as a thing. Again, I thought it was just my own language inability, or maybe they just can't count that high, or don't know how to qualify. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think people also wonder maybe why do we want to know how many children they have? What's the purpose of this? Do we want to count them because we want to do something with them? Because perhaps in their own culture that is never really, doesn't really come up, it isn't a topic.
Oh, I like that. I like that too. You know, here we are coming in and asking them questions about their family and about their status, and yeah, why would we need that information? That's asking innocently, but not realizing it's a yeah.
My specific problem with this question was that she asked me to bring clothes for the children, and so I asked how many girls, how many boys, you know, what age. But children is only one example.
Yeah, and you know, when you say that, of course, in that situation, you really want to know the number. But it reminds me of another thing that I wrote down for my homework, and that is the fact that in eating together, the practice of eating in our culture, in our Western culture, at least in the Netherlands, is very different than in other cultures. Because when we were overseas, in this particular culture, people always eat together. They are always expecting visitors, so they always make more than they would ever need to eat themselves as a small family. So, you know, it's not a matter of, okay, how many people are going to be here tonight, so how much do I cook? How many potatoes do I peel? That's not at all the way people think. You make food, and you just make lots of food, and whoever comes is welcome, and they can all sit together and eat. So it's probably the same with this woman, you know, I want you to bring clothes for my children, period. You don't need to know how many, just bring lots of clothes. Perhaps that's what she thought.
She wasn't bothered by the question. This is not the problem. The problem was that she couldn't answer right away. She was very imprecise, as it says here in the material.
Yeah, so I'm guessing that she was probably trying to figure out what exactly do I need to tell this for, and how many of my children do I count in there? Maybe how many of my children do I need clothes for? Because if she had some adult children, they wouldn't be included. So there is some things going on in her brain that wasn't expressed.
I don't think she thought of something when she answered. When I first asked, she said she had 3, because there were 3 living with her right away. And then I asked her again, what age? And she said about 5 different ages, because in my thinking, I think she has 5 children. And then she said she had 2 more. And I'm guessing it was about the wife of her older son and their baby boy. So she added, like she forgot about them. It wasn't anything premeditated or anything.
No, I don't think that. It's just that people are taken aback with such direct questions, perhaps. I'm not sure.
This actually reminds me of the way my daughter, who is on the autism spectrum, will answer questions. She will stop to try to figure out what you mean by that question, when to us it seems pretty straightforward. But she's kind of trying to sort through, and especially, for instance, we were somewhere when she lived in America, and someone asked her for her driver's license. She doesn't have a driver's license. I said to her, they want to see your ID. Okay, otherwise she just spent a long time explaining to that person that she didn't have a driver's license. What the person wanted was her ID. So, yeah, sometimes the people are thinking in different categories than we're used to thinking of. As you pointed out, Mariana, when someone said, how many children do you have? And then as this, and Coco's saying there's this imprecision all along the way, and there could be many reasons for that. Let's move on to a different example. Ron and Debbie, do you have a different example?
Yeah, there I am. That a different example, in which part is that? For the
A different example of a cultural difference you noticed that's connected to communication.
You know, I think one cultural difference, I'm sure we can connect this to communication somehow, but anyway, they do not make their children do anything. We tend to make our children do stuff, you know, like you have to go to school, you have to put your clothes on, you have to, you know, come to dinner. And they don't do that. And it's a big difference because we tend to, we look ahead to, you know, in the future, if you have an education, you'll be able to do this, this, and this. And if you don't, if you drop out of school after 8th grade and don't even go to high school, you know, then you'll be carrying rocks at a construction site or something. And so we tend to look more towards the future, and they tend to look around them and think, well, I've never seen anyone benefit by getting an education. So anyway, the parents don't force the children to stay in school. And so if they don't want to go to school, they don't go. Well, many of us wouldn't have gone to school if our parents didn't say, you have to go, and drive us there. So anyway, that affects our culture a lot, I think, our education.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
But it's forcing children to do something. Is this only about school or about in general for everything?
Are we on? Well, you know, for example, we were in the village one time, and this mother was coming along with her little girl, and she was completely naked. And she just, you know, the only method was to say, look what a bad girl she is. She won't even get dressed, you know. And I think, she's 4 years old. Make her get dressed, you know. So I don't know if it applies to everything, but it's not only going to school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is a cultural difference that people see in other cultures also. Often when I call it solo versus solidarity training, we train our kids to grow up and live solo. We anticipate they're going to live apart from us. They're going to make their own way in the world. and people who are highly communal, they train those little kids to think that the group is where it's at. So it appears to us that they are spoiling their children. You will even see this among traditional Japanese people, the very little kids, they're spoiled. And then when they get older, the group puts a lot of pressure on them to perform, to do this or that. And because they want to stay in the group is where it's at, that's the good life, they conform. And you can see this in Roma culture also. When that little girl gets older, someone's going to say to her, "You're going to marry Joe over there," depending on the Roma culture. And if she doesn't, she's ostracized. She just might go ahead and marry Joe. Whereas we train up our kids to, we hope, make a wise choice on their own. Or I'll give you another example from the Sindhi culture where people choose their own marriage partners, but the dad might say, "We're in a music group and you're going to learn to play the drums." Well, maybe you'd rather learn to play the oboe, but that's not the option. Dad said I was going to learn to play the drums. I'm going to learn to play the drums. So it's not necessarily a print oral difference, but it is a focus on community versus training your kids up in a different way difference.
I also think that it can be a future orientation versus a now orientation that, of course, we see a ton with Roma. You know, you've got this, when I'm disciplining my children, I'm not just thinking about right now. In fact, if I was thinking about right now, I just let them go ahead and do what they were doing because it's easier. But I'm thinking, gosh, if I let this behavior happen, then in the future, it will be worse. In the future, this will happen. In the future, these are the implications of this behavior. And so when I'm thinking into the future as I discipline, they're thinking about the now, like what's easier for me right now, or what's easier to deal with. Just let the kid go without clothes, or whatever it is. So I wonder too, if I really like that idea, Mary, that you were talking about the group mentality versus the individual mentality. But I think that future orientation versus the now orientation could also play into that disciplining, which gets us off on a different track rather than the print versus oral. Just was an insight there.
Yeah, but it has to do with communication, and I think when we communicate with children who have that kind of grooming and upbringing, then it's very hard if we are expecting intrinsic motivation from children who are not intrinsically motivated to do things, but only by group pressure. So it would be interesting to think through the ramifications of that.
Very good point. And I'm not a trained educator, so I have no idea where to go with that, but that's a very good point.
Yeah, because that will affect the classroom if you're trying to teach people, have them all pay attention to you, and they're getting up and down, going in and out. Yeah, I mean that's what even church in Ed Pastor was talking about how you just kind of have to get used to a whole bunch of people going out, and it never is just one person goes out. One girl gets up, and then 3 friends go with her, and then they come back all together 5 minutes later or whatever. It's all these kinds of things.
It's a challenge.
It's a challenge.
Yes, I agree with you, Ron, and I think we often encounter it. So I turned my video off because I couldn't hear you very well, and it's better now. So I think we often encounter in classrooms where we are frustrated because we're asking something like some kind of response perhaps of one pupil, one student, and they're reluctant to give it, or they don't say anything at all because they feel maybe put on the spot and they're not used to that at home. So we're expecting things that really they are not getting at home, and I think it's a very big difference that we need to learn how to cope with if we want to communicate with children who function better in a group setting. So that's why I think Marlene has thought also of these games. Education games are very important for oral cultures or for group cultures because they involve everybody together, and they don't single out one person in having to perform something that he or she is uncomfortable with.
And one of the things that we've struggled with, even in the Slovak culture, which would be a more literate culture, is this whole group mentality of group shame in the classroom. And yeah, that plays on this group thing, and it helps, it's a way of disciplining that acknowledges the group, but yet, man, it can be really, really detrimental to the psyche of the whole group or of a couple of people. So yeah, finding ways to discipline and to work without using group shame when you're talking about a group-oriented people.
Yeah, and a group-oriented people wouldn't necessarily use shame. So.
But yet, when you think of the example, who was it that gave that example? Debbie, I think. There's this girl who's naked, who should really get dressed. Her mother wants her to get dressed, and she refuses. And then the mother kind of shames her, in a sense. She talks down toward this girl and talks bad about her. And that is a very common, I've seen that a lot, that people will say really bad things about their children, and yet they don't really mean it, because it seems that they don't mean it because they don't follow up on it and make their kids do something. So there is a dynamic there that I'm not sure how to make use of, the local culture in knowing how to communicate to the children from that culture. It's an interesting question.
Yeah. Is there some other, let's keep that in our minds as we continue to think about what implication this has for our actual work. But is there another difference that people have noted?
I had written one down. Oh no, that was for I had written this one down. It's about how to communicate things to the wider group. And I'm thinking about how in the Netherlands and in many Western countries we have newspapers, and people read the newspapers a lot to be able to get their information about lots of things. Like, what's the weather going to be like? We look at the weather forecast rather than at the sky. And that would be in a different culture. How does news get passed on in the cultures that you work with? In the culture that I worked in for a while, they had community work days in which there were always lots of announcements made, and because most of the people went to church, they did a lot of community announcements in church and funeral announcements and all that kind of stuff. But during the week, there would also be, if there was a death, for instance, or if there was something that happened. For instance, someone got sick and had to be taken to the hospital out of, away from the island. Then that kind of news passed around from mouth to mouth. And how does that happen in the cultures that you are with? I think it's definitely a difference on print orientation and not. And yet, in our cultures, we have watching the news, and we have, watching things on our screens that seems to be replacing a lot of newspaper reading as well, and newspapers are going out of print. So I'm not sure what the difference is.
Yeah, it's a good question.
This is Ron. I think it goes back to that continuum, Mary, that you were talking about between orality and literacy, and even going beyond, like into a post-literacy kind of thing, where or digital literacy for some people that they're getting into. I was thinking something that's happened in the village that we go to a lot down in the South is it's a good sized place, and they put in a little supermarket. It's a chain supermarket called Profi, that Coco would know about that one. And the Roma people, they're used to going to the town plaza piazza place for market on Thursdays and on Sundays, and that's how they would buy everything. They would buy everything from a person who is selling that thing, and ask them about, any questions they had about that thing and how much it cost, and figure out the portion that they wanted of it, how many onions or how big a piece of meat. And now that there's a supermarket, people go into the supermarket and they're looking around, and like there's no one to help them. There's people at the checkout thing, maybe there's people behind the meat counter, but everything else is like in these bins with there's no one to tell them how much it costs. It's all written on a little tag, and it tells you what a thing is, but you can't ask anybody because there's no one there to ask.
So if you're not literate.
So if you're not literate and you can't read things, we've been a few times with a couple different people who are not literate, and it's a little bit of a challenge. It's a little it was a little funny, but and then to know, for them to count up the money that you're spending was they weren't doing that very well either.
And to understand the protocol, or like how to wait in line for this thing or that thing, it was just beyond them. Confusing.
Yeah, so that was just another thing we noticed.
This is John. We see the continuum thing played out here, and just in thinking during our discussion today about the Slovak culture, not talking about the Roma culture that we work predominantly among, but the Slovak culture here, at least in the east of Slovakia, I think is much farther, more towards the oral, and maybe just in the last few decades has become more orally based. Just from the fact that, when we go to other cities in Western Europe or west of here, we see people on the buses and trains sitting down reading a book or a newspaper, and you just don't see that here. People just don't read and don't seem to enjoy reading at all. When you ask people what they read, you come across people from time to time who really enjoy it, but for the most part, they kind of look at you funny, like, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to
even
read
really well-educated people, teachers and pastors, don't spend any time reading, except for it's specifically for.
They really have to do it.
Yeah.
It's not a pleasure thing for them. And even here, just the place that we're sitting right now, but in the villages, the place we live now used to be a village on the edge of Košice, and now it's kind of been incorporated as a suburb. But there are these speakers on the posts all around the village here. And this still functions way out in the remote villages, even, that when there's an announcement to be made, they don't send out an email, they don't pass out flyers and stuff like that. They come on over the loudspeaker and announce it. And the folks come out, and you see it when the weather's good. Folks come out because they play a little song, some kind of music or whatever, so his announcement's coming. So the folks make their way out to stand by the gate, and then they listen to the announcement that might be about if somebody has died and when the funeral is, or there's potatoes being sold at the church parking lot, or just any kind of those general announcements. That's how they're made. And even farther, that Slovaks are. We noticed that they prefer. They're getting to where they prefer written communication when we talk with them. So we can send emails and messenger and SMS, text messages and stuff like that. But with the Roma especially, I'm kind of amazed that when we send an email or a message or something like that with some of them, even the ones that we consider very literate, it might be 3 or 4 days before they respond back to it. But if you call them, of course, they would prefer to have a phone call or a person-to-person conversation. That's really the way to get things done. And for somebody like me, at least, who really prefers that written, I love
especially with the language barrier. It's easier to figure it all out, write it all out, and get it right, and then send it.
Yeah. And I prefer the written, but I typically have to keep reminding myself from time to time that they prefer having a phone call or having a personal conversation. That's how business really gets done.
Yeah, I think I can relate to that. I remember, and Mary, you know this Sinti woman in Germany, Ota, and you can write an email to her because she has an email address, but it's very hard for her to write an email back. So I agree on that. The other observation you made, I find interesting that even educated Slovak people will not read anything for enjoyment, and I wonder if it has anything to do with how in the school systems or in the schools reading is presented or viewed or taught, because reading can be seen in many different ways. Of course, you need to learn to read in order to read the prices in the grocery store, like Ron and Debbie said, or you need to learn to read in order to read the Bible, or to learn to read in order to get a job. But if you learn to read for enjoyment, then you do a lot of different activities with that, and perhaps they haven't learned that in school. I don't know.
You are absolutely right. You're absolutely. The books that they read as they're learning to read are awful. I mean, really. And there's in the schools, they do not teach enjoyment of reading. They
teach reading for utility, but not for.
Yeah. So you've hit the nail. Yeah, that's for sure. Part of absolutely.
Yeah, and so later, maybe sometime during this Skype times, we can talk about how to make fun books with Bloom, and because it adds so much to life if people can express their creativity in writing a funny poem or a joke or whatever, and that can really make a difference at some point.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love that.
Well, we have some games in the bar to make fun stories. The fun animal.
We also have to remember that there are many ways to express ourselves creatively, and maybe people prefer or choose a different way to sing and make up songs, to tell a joke. We've all probably met people who cannot tell a joke. They just don't have the verbal skills. My dad, my brother-in-law, they just can't tell a joke. So from our perspective, it's enriched our lives to be able to read. But it's interesting to also encounter people who say the people in our culture who became literate lost something. And that's also something interesting and something to consider. I'm going to add one more difference that I saw, which we've touched on. But that is that in the Sinti church, the kids come and they go. And they go from grandpa to uncle, whatever, aunt. When we would go to the Sinti church, we would bring a lot of stuff to entertain our kids through the worship service. Or if we went on a long car trip to some tent meeting, we would bring things in the car for the kids to do. The Sinti people did not. The kids entertained themselves in the community. If that makes any sense. It was the social interaction that was entertaining. And that to me is definitely a print versus oral culture difference to some extent. It also points out something that the kids, that in an oral culture, the kids are always hanging around not always, but tend to hang around the adults because that's how they're going to learn. And kids coming and going, kids in for instance, a women's Bible study, if you're planning to do something with Roma women, you have to figure in the kid factor. That's just the way it is. And that's, I think, to some extent, part of an oral culture.
Mary, that's a great observation. We have seen that as well, about like us taking stuff for our kids to do, but there really being nothing for the other kid. The community is going to entertain them, if you will. One of the things, so we go to a church that is led by a Slovak, but is primarily Roma. So it's Roma and Slovak together. And so they've got a lot of this like combining of cultures. And one of the ways that it's become more Slovak is noise and things like that are not encouraged during the sermon time, especially, and even during the singing time. And so rather than the kids being in and out and learning as they go, learning as they're hearing and as they're catching, like you said, the kids are just in another room doing nothing. So there's this kind of, they're playing on phones and stuff. So there's this kind of, they're not really meeting either. They're not having things for their kids to do quietly at their place, but they're also not really learning in the community because the Slovak way has said, but you have to be quiet. So I think in general, in that way, the church has lost out because it's not found the best of both cultures. It's almost found the negativeness to both cultures. I don't know how to say that, but just an interesting observation from what you said.
This happens a lot in the south of Romania with the Roma, that they don't entertain their children with anything, and they just go around from one person to another. And usually when I'm there, I have something to color for the children to keep them still. But the problem is that parents also want, and they become interested in what I have for the children rather than for the church service. Or so I don't know where the balance would be. Or what could we get from their interaction, entertainment? Could we get something from there that is good for us also?
That's a really good question. I have a friend, I haven't seen her in many years, but her thing was to design worship services that included all generations. That would be connect with kids and adults. Yeah. Or maybe some of you have some other experiences or ideas about how we could use this social interaction thingy, how that could be used.
Do they sing all together? Do the children like singing? Or do some music?
Yes, and in the church service, usually they have their moment when they go in front and sing, because they need to know that they are important and they can participate somehow.
Maybe you can sing together during the service.
With singing is no problem. With the preaching is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, preaching is a problem. Let's address that problem later. Mariana had to leave, and maybe some of the rest of us need to leave in a little bit also. Is there anything that someone wants to share on this topic? Otherwise, we can go on to another question or another part of the discussion material. Okay. We've talked about a lot of different things today, and rather than go on to this other assignment that we had or thing to think about, I'd like us to reflect on the discussion, and if there's anything that we take away from this discussion, we're saying, oh, well, now I understand that, and I would do X instead of Y. Or that's why this thing works and that other thing doesn't.
Reading the material and also from our discussion, there are many things that it's like mind-opening. They made me understand why some things don't work at all, and how I should change the way I approach them. There are some details, but very important details in communication and how I see them and how I could make them understand some things. If it's possible, I want to ask a question that's not about the topic from today, but maybe one day it could become, or maybe one day you could help me understand better. I come from a culture that is very competitive. Even in school, I'm sometimes fighting with arguments because I wouldn't promote competition. And thinking of games and activities, I think I can't think of a game or an activity that doesn't have the smallest part of competition. And even with the children in the South, with the Roma children, even if we just, I don't know, sing, or I try to think of non-competitive games or activities. Even then, there are some children who stand up from the chair, come to me, and they ask me, wasn't I the best of everyone? Or did you like the way I performed because I'm the best, or I'm the smartest, or whatever? Um, so this is something that concerns me a lot because I am not um, able to be non-competitive and to think of activities or games or and especially with the oral culture, they need to be the best. They need to know nobody's ahead of them, or you know what I mean. Well, we are a little educated to let another one be the best because I'm the best in other areas, you know. But to be honest, we all like to be the best, and we think we are the most important in the world. Um, so this concerns me a lot, and I really don't know how. In one of the materials I read about a school that is totally non-competitive and like I'm not sure in Belgium or where in. Oh, I read an article about Belgium that schools are totally non-competitive. They don't give grades, and um, um, you know what I mean. So I would really love to learn this because I think it's a big problem in Romania.
That's very interesting. Does anybody have a response?
No, only I will think about it.
My response would be to ask why. Why do those children do that? And then keep at that. This is a technique from asset-based community development, is to ask why until there's no more why. So why do those children do that? Because they want to be the best. Why do they want to be the best? Because I don't know.
I think they hear a lot, oh, you're stupid. You're not good at anything. You're ugly. You know, when the parents want to punish them, they would rather punish them like this. And so the girls come to me and ask me, am I not the prettiest girl? Or, you know, and I always try to tell them, especially when I talk with one-on-one with them, I always tell them, oh, you're so beautiful. You're so smart. Oh, you knew this. Oh, you know, but they still need to hear that they are special, and they are. But how can I help them understand how special they are, and they don't need to, you know, because we all need to hear that we are someone, or we are somebody. But
Yeah.
the parents are very negative with them. Oh, you're not good of anything. Oh, go away. Leave me alone. You are a bother to me.
This is Ron. I have I heard about this a couple times from Bob Hitching, who works with Roma in Croatia and Serbia and Hungary. That this is an issue in their communities where they go as well, and they have like a vacation Bible school kind of program that they'll do. And in part of that program, they get all the kids together, and they would like write their name on a card or something like that, and each person they'll go at a certain time, and they'll put that person in front of everybody, and they'll talk about all the good things about that person, and everybody claps for that person and says, "Yay, Ron! Yay, Debbie!" Wherever their name is, and so they do that through the whole group, which would take a long time when you got a bunch of kids, but they try to do that to show them how special they are. So I think like what you're doing there is something that they don't always get. You notice they get the negative feedback, but they don't always get the positive feedback, and so that's something we can all think about a little more.
It's also true that, that's an interesting thing, and that they have this, the Hitchings have this whole club system. I forget what it's called. It has to do with bees. That is
It's called the Una Club.
the Una Club, yes, that does a lot of that sort of thing. I had some thought, but it eludes me now. Oh, that when we know our true identity, that we are beloved children of God and uniquely created, that might help a lot, but I don't know how you but then the question is, how do you get that across? Because even people who grew up with some of that idea, like myself, you still have issues. Different kind of issues. But I am thinking about this song, "Don't You Know That You're a Pearl in God's Hands."
I sang this song for my daughter when she was a little girl. But I can't sing very nice, so she said, "Please, Mommy, stop. Don't sing anymore."
Yeah, so that didn't do much for her.
No.
Funny. Okay. Well, I propose that we pray about these things, and let these ideas sort of percolate. Marlene is big into having ideas percolate. And so her suggestion for our homework for next time, open. No, it has to do with that we go through I'm looking for a file. So I'm going to ask Marlene to explain it while I look for this file. I just found it.
Yeah.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes. That we go through like this difference about how oral and print communicators think differently, and give examples from our own experience. How people learn by hearing and learn by seeing, learn by observing. Think of all these different things. And also perhaps to make it even more concrete, is how might we use this in communicating, and a concrete example of how you could use this in communicating with oral communicators. How you might change the way you've been communicating with oral communicators in light of these differences. And we can also challenge these differences also. Not everyone yeah.
When we start talking about it, it just happens.
Say that again, Marlene.
Als we erover beginnen, komt dat vanzelf.
Okay. So Marlene's saying, as we begin to understand these differences and talk about them, then we will naturally start to apply it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, is everyone good with this? I'll take that for a yes.
We're good with it. Thanks, Mary. Sorry.
Okay. I'm also going to send out this doodle thing again, but this time, with the actual dates that are actually happening, not the ones that are past. And if you have any comments to make about, like, now we've been talking for about an hour and a half. That's great. That's too long. That's not long enough. Give us that feedback also. There's a lot more out there that we could all be reading, but we're also all busy. If you want suggestions of stuff to read, let me know. Or if you've read something you think would be useful for the rest of us, please share that.
Okay.
And I am going to send out an email where I'm going to try to put this kind of thing in a Dropbox that we can all access. And then I'm going to discuss, I think that the suggestion of having our own YouTube channel where we can listen to this recording is also good.
Oh, yeah. Good idea.
Okay, so I'll get together with Keith and George to set that up. Because, George just recorded this. Okay. Ron, would you be willing to close in prayer?
Sure. Let's pray. God, I just thank you for this opportunity for us from different places to get together and talk about these things, to understand more how oral cultures work, and how getting your gospel into people's lives, how it can be more effective. Just thank you for each person's ministry, for Alina, who wasn't able to be here today, and everyone who's participated. Just thank you for it. Thank you for this technology that makes it possible. And just go with us this week. Help us to be able to think about how to apply these things, and help us to listen to your voice in all of it as we go along too. Thank you for Jesus' sake. Amen.
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 It's been good to talk with you all. I look forward to it next week.
Okay.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.